Hi guys, hope everyone's having a fantastic day today and keeping nice and warm. Winter is nearly over, thank goodness. While it is still cold though, I thought we would do some indoor projects today, and one of the biggest questions that I get asked about is how to get started with a worm farm. So for those of you who don't know, we actually do sell worms. We sell worm compost and we sell worm wee or tea, but we only sell that over the warmer months. So over winter, we tend to put our worms into breeding boxes and we let them overwinter. So I thought I will show you the cheapest, quickest, easiest way to get a small tower happening at home. You do not need to go out and buy one of those expensive commercial worm farms. You can make your own. All we're going to be using to make our worm farm today is a couple of these containers and lids that I picked up at Bunnings. These were reduced to $1. Now I've got 3 containers, 2 6-litre containers, and got one larger one which is an 8.6 litre container, and that's going to be our base. It's where we're going to catch our wee. Now we're going to be stacking our containers on top like so. This is going to be the first bed that we pop in there. We'll fill this with our worms. When this bed is full, we then add another layer on top. We then fill that up with food. That will draw the worms up from the bottom layer. When they've come up to the top layer, we can then harvest that worm compost, harvest any eggs that are in there, and then start the cycle again. Once we've cleared that out, that will then become the new top layer. So to get started, all we need to do is create a way for our worms to get from one layer to the other, and we're going to be poking some holes in the bottom of our containers. Now, if you have a drill, that's going to be probably the easiest method for you. I don't have one, so I do have a metal skewer, and I have a candle that is just off to the side. You probably can't see that in the shot there, but let me move a bit closer. I am just going to heat that up in the candle flame there just for a moment or so. I'm not sure, I can't really quite see what I'm doing, so I think it's touching in there. And all we're going to be doing is poking a hole straight through. So that should be just starting to poke through there now, guys. I'm not sure if you can see. Okay. Now, I will go back through a second time after I've done all my holes, heat the skewer up a little bit longer because I do want the holes to be a bit bigger than that. But that gives you the basic idea. I'm just going to poke several holes all the way through. You don't need to have heaps. It's basically just some way for the worms to get from the bottom level up to the top. Now, we don't need to have any in our big base container because, as I said, this is going to be catching the wee. We want to keep this one whole, so don't put any in your bottom layer. All right, now I'm just going to pause. Going to pop in a whole bunch of holes, and I'm going to come back and show you the next step. Okay guys, so we're back. We have just drilled, or well, rather poked holes all around the outside of our containers. One of the reasons that I have gone around the outside is you may be able to see that this has a little lip. So the moisture is going to fall into this little drain part here. It's going to be able to drain into the bottom layer and wick away from the worms. One of the biggest factors with a worm farm is you do want to keep it moist at all times, never wet and never dry. So that's going to help the excess moisture to drain away and keep the worms just that little bit drier in the rest of the container there. So I've put holes in both of our top 2 containers. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to put some bedding in for the worms. So we're going to line our container with damp newspaper. So all you want to do is have some pre-moistened newspaper. I'm just going to see if I can separate a couple of sheets here really quickly without tearing it too much, because of course newspaper wants to fall apart the second that it gets wet. Okay, so just some damp newspaper. Pop that into our container. One of the other reasons that I like to use newspaper, especially in a container like this, is because these containers are clear and worms don't like the light. By having newspaper around the outside, it's going to help them to feel dark and protected, and they're going to really appreciate that. So they're always going to be trying to get away from the light, If you can give them a damp, dark place, that's going to keep your worms happy and they're not going to try and escape your farm, because if your worms are unhappy, they're either going to escape or die or both. All right, so basically we have got our lining. I'm just going to put another little strip on either side there so we can keep the worms nice and dark, and then we'll be back for adding the worms. Rightio, so we have got our worms in our first layer of our tower. We've got our drainage on the bottom there, so they'll be able to start dripping down the wormweed there for you to collect. One thing, depending on where you get your worms from, if they don't come with a whole lot of bedding, you will need to add some bedding. You can just use anything really that's going to keep the worms cool and moist. So you can use chopped up newspaper as long as it's damp. Don't let it dry out. You can use coconut coir. You can use coffee grounds. Some people say don't put coffee grounds in your worm farms. They don't like it. As long as they're used coffee grounds, they're actually sterile. They're totally inert and the worms won't have any problems with it. We do use that a lot. But what we've got in ours today is some compost that we've already had breaking down from our existing towers, because we do have quite a lot of worm farms here. So we'll just pull aside that top layer, see if we can find some worms. They'll all be hiding down the bottom. Oh, there they are. So let's see if we can find some more. There we go. So they've all only been in there for a couple of minutes and they've already buried their way down the bottom. Now, in this size container, I would recommend no more than about 300 for just this level. If you want to have more than that, add an additional layer, which we're about to do. You can add as many layers to your tower as you like, as is safe to do so without it tipping over, or you can just create additional towers. So I'm quite happy to put about 3 or 4 layers onto this table. I think that's still fairly stable. These are interlocking containers. So if you come along here, you're going to see when we've popped this in, there's no real gaps along there anywhere for the worms to get out. The bottom layer does sink into the top part of the container below it, so they're pretty stable. So as long as you're not going ridiculously high, you'll be able to get another layer on top. Now, with the layer that we are putting on top, I'm only going to put a little bit of worms and a little bit of compost in that, because that is going to be our feeding layer. We want to encourage the worms from this layer up to the top layer, because we want to be harvesting this compost soon. This compost is not broken down. To use this or to sell this, I would have to sieve it. This particular one does have a lot of wood chips and larger pieces still in it. Some of our other towers and our other, like our breeding boxes, for example, only ever have fine particles go into those, so they're pretty well good to go as soon as you've taken out the worms and the eggs. So we'll pop on our next layer, and then we're going to add into that our food. Okay, so just before we go ahead and pop on the next layer of our worm tower, I just thought I would clarify a little bit about what I said about only having 300 or so worms in a container that size. You can actually have more. The reason why I said that is because the worms that have been harvested today have actually been inside their farms for quite some time. They're very happy and very healthy, and so therefore they have been busy breeding. So I know that in this particular batch there's a lot of eggs, and I thought I'd take the opportunity to show you what a worm egg or a worm casing looks like. So if you can see this little yellow ball here, that is actually a worm casing or a worm egg. Now, worms on average will have between 1 and 5 worms per casing. Generally it's 3, and they do breed very quickly. They can lay eggs multiple times per week. So very, very quickly you're going to find that your tower is going to fill up and be overfull. Worms will generally breed best when there are a moderate amount of worms in their space. Too few, they're not going to be able to find a mate. Too many, they're going to assume that they're going to need to be competing for food. So if there's a good amount of worms in there, they're being fed well, they'll be happy and they'll be breeding lots for you. So with that being said, we are now adding our last layer, for now anyway, onto our worm tower. As I said, just popping in a very shallow layer of compost. There are a few worms and a few eggs in there as well, because we do want this to be our feeder level. Now, I didn't poke any holes through that newspaper. Believe you me, the worms are going to eat through it. They will find their way up to the top. What we want to make sure is that the bottom layer is full enough so that when we add our top layer, it is in contact with the base of the feeding level. I did have a look at that before I put anything into that level because they're going to want to be able to actually reach and sense the food. So what we have on hand today is just some lettuce scraps, some chopped up banana peels, and some crushed up eggshells. You can pretty much put anything into your worm farm that you'd be happy to eat, as well as a few things that you're not. I don't know too many people out there who'd be eating eggshells. What they don't tend to like, of course, is chili. They don't tend to like citrus. They really don't like onion, garlic, things like that, anything that's too spicy. You can actually put it into your worm farms, but just make sure that you chop it up really, really finely and only super small doses, because if their mix becomes too acidic or too spicy, they're going to want to leave. They're not going to like that environment. It will break down on its own. That's why I say it is safe to add it in very, very small amounts. But generally speaking, leafy greens, they love them. They love bananas. They love the actual inside of eggs. Quickest way for me to harvest some of my worms is to break an egg on top of one of the farms, and they're all going to come to the surface looking for it. Another favorite of worms is any kind of melon. So watermelon, rock melon, anything like that. They absolutely love it. They love pumpkin. Loads and loads and loads of different things that you can be feeding your worms. So now we've got our layer of food in there. We are going to put on one final layer, and that is a blanket for the top. Now again, just using dampened newspaper here. You can use a hessian sack. A lot of people like to use that. You can use a piece of old carpet. It's really just so that we're creating that moist, damp, dark environment for our worms, and anything that you can find that's going to achieve that, they're going to be really happy with. So last but not least, popping on our lid, making sure that that's clipped down so it's nice and secure. And there we have our worm farm. So once that top layer is full, we'll assume that most of our worms have moved from the middle layer up to the top layer. We can then go through and we can sift that compost, make sure we're taking out all the large pieces, any eggs or any straggler worms. Within about a week or two, we will start getting a little bit of wormweed dropping through there. But what we just want to make sure is that the mix in there is never drying out. You can add water to it if you're not feeding your worms very often, because what they'll do is they're actually going to resort to eating that newspaper, and the newspaper will dry them out a lot. So if you're not feeding them much, they'll eat the newspaper. Their mix is going to get dry, so just add a little bit of water. What we will do is we will leave it there for now. I'm going to come back and check on our worm farm in a couple of weeks just to show you guys where it's at, how much liquid we've collected, how many additional worms we've had that we have filled it up to the top, and I'll show you how we actually go about collecting our worms and our eggs and also our compost. So I hope you enjoyed that video, guys. Sorry, I'm really struggling with my words today. I think I need to go and have a coffee, and that's all. All right, thanks for watching, guys. Till next time.